settle in. Wherever you're lying right now, let it hold you. Let the blankets be heavier than they were a minute ago. Let your jaw unclench just slightly, and let your hands go loose wherever they're resting. There's nothing you need to do for the next little while. Nothing to solve, nowhere to be. Just this voice and a very old road, and the slow business of falling asleep. By the way, I'm Andrew. Before we go any further, if you're comfortable, this is a good moment for one small thing. If you'd like more of these to fall asleep to, staying subscribed just means the next one is already waiting for you whenever you need it. And if you're still awake enough to type, I'd love to know down in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it happens to be for you right now. I'm always a little curious how far these stories travel while everyone's drifting off. And if there's some other place or some other old journey you'd like walked through like this next time, leave that in the comments too. Now, let's go back to the road. Tonight we're going to walk beside a caravan. Not a fast journey. Not an exciting one, not in the way films make these things exciting. No chases, no sword fights, none of that. Just the real, physical, footstep by footstep truth of how goods and stories used to move across the widest continent on Earth. Back before trains, before engines, before anyone could cross a desert in anything faster than a walking pace. We call it the Silk Road now. The people walking it never called it that. That name was invented by a German geographer in the 19th century, long after the road itself had quieted down. The traders themselves just called it work. A route. The way to Kashgar. The way to Samarkand. The way home. But it was real, and it was enormous. And for almost 2,000 years, it was one of the main threads holding the old world together. Let your eyes stay closed. Let your breathing slow down to match the pace of a walking camel. Slower than you think, almost lazy. One foot after another, after another. No hurry in it at all. We begin in the west of China, in a city that doesn't exist anymore under that name. The people of the time called it Chang'an. Today the city on that spot is called Xi'an, and it still remembers, in its bones, that it used to be the beginning of everything. Chapter 1. Leaving Chang'an. Picture the gates of the city at first light. Not sunrise exactly, a little before it, when the sky is more gray than gold, and the air still holds the coolness of the night. The camels are already loaded. This part happened before dawn, in the dark, by lamplight, because loading a camel properly takes patience, and patience is easier to find when the world is quiet. Bales of silk wrapped tight in oiled cloth against the damp, lacquerware packed in straw, small clay jars of cinnamon and ginger, bolts of colored thread. Somewhere in the load, wrapped very carefully, a few sheets of something almost nobody outside China has ever seen. Paper. The caravan itself is a slow-moving village. Merchants, yes, but also their hired guards, their translators, cooks, farriers to tend the animals' feet, and boys, always boys, 12 or 13 years old, whose only job is to walk at the front of each string of camels and keep them calm. 2,000 years before any of this, a Chinese official named Zhang Qian had been sent west by his emperor on a diplomatic mission, and he vanished for over a decade, captured, held, released, wandering. And when he finally made his way home, he didn't bring back what he'd been sent for. He brought back something bigger. Word that there were whole kingdoms out there to the west. Grapes, horses stronger than any in China, roads already worn smooth by other people's feet. He hadn't opened the Silk Road exactly. Parts of it had been walked by someone for centuries already. But he'd shown his emperor that it led somewhere worth reaching. That's the story sitting quietly underneath every caravan that follows him. Somebody always has to go first, not knowing what's out there, and then everyone else gets to follow a known path. Our caravan tonight has no such uncertainty. The path is known, worn, marked with the bones of old campfires and the rings of stones where 1,000 other travelers have paused to cook 1,000 other meals. The gates open. The city guards nod them through. This is routine. This happens most mornings. Caravans leaving, caravans arriving, the whole rhythm of it as regular as tides. And then the walls of Chang'an are behind them, and the road narrows, and the real slowness begins. You don't need to hold on to any of the details. Let them drift. A camel's hooves on packed earth make a sound like a very slow, very soft drum. Not urgent, not military, just steady. If you're getting sleepy already, that's fine. That's the whole point. Chapter 2. Toward the Desert. The first stretch west of Chang'an isn't desert yet. It's farmland, then scrubland. Then the land starts to lose its color, the way a photograph fades if you leave it in the sun too long. Green gives way to tan. Tan gives way to gray-white. And somewhere in there, without any clear line to mark it, you're in the edge of the Gobi. Caravans didn't cross deserts in the way you might imagine, straight lines under a blazing sun. They moved from oasis to oasis, the way a person crossing a river moves from stone to stone. Every oasis was a small miracle of water pushed up from somewhere deep underground, or channeled down from mountains far away through tunnels dug centuries earlier. Some of those irrigation tunnels, called carrés, are still in use today, still carrying the same snowmelt down from the same mountains, more than 1,000 years after the people who dug them died. Dunhuang is the first great pause. It sits right at the edge where the fertile world gives up and the true desert begins. And because of that, it became something more than a rest stop. It became a place where people prayed for a safe crossing and gave thanks for a safe arrival. Just outside the town, carved into a cliff face over the course of roughly 1,000 years, are hundreds of cave shrines, painted inside with more color and gold leaf than you'd think a cave could hold. Merchants funded many of them, not out of pure piety necessarily, though maybe that too, but because the desert ahead was genuinely dangerous, and a little insurance, spiritual or otherwise, felt like a reasonable thing to buy before setting out into a place with no water for days at a stretch. The caravan rests here longer than usual. 2 nights, maybe 3. The animals need it more than the people do, honestly. A camel can go many days without drinking, longer than almost any other animal its size, but it still needs real rest before the hardest stretch of any journey. And the stretch ahead into the Taklamakan is the hardest stretch there is. The Taklamakan. The name is sometimes translated, probably too dramatically, as the place you go in and don't come out. Historians argue about whether that translation is even accurate. It might just mean old ruins in one of the older regional languages. But the dramatic version stuck because deserts invite drama, even when, like tonight, we're choosing to tell the story slowly, gently, without any of the fear that real travelers must have carried. Here's a detail worth holding on to, softly, as you drift. Caravans crossing the worst of the Taklamakan often traveled at night. Not during the day. The days were too hot, the sun too punishing, the light off the sand too harsh on tired eyes. So they slept through the brutal middle of the day in whatever shade a tent or a dune's shadow could offer, and they walked at night under the kind of sky you basically cannot see anymore from any city on Earth. Thousands of stars, no moon competing with them most nights. The camels' bells, each one tuned slightly differently on purpose so a caravan master walking at the rear could tell by sound alone whether all his animals were still moving together, still in line, still safe, ringing softly through hours and hours of dark. That's the sound I want you to hold on to. Small bells, unevenly spaced, drifting in and out with the sway of walking animals. Not a melody, not trying to be beautiful, just a way of keeping track of each other in the dark. Chapter 3. Crossing by Starlight. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from walking at night that's different from ordinary tiredness. It's quieter. The mind wanders more than the body does. A guard walking near the back of the line might find himself thinking about a home he left 8 months ago, a wife, a child who's probably grown taller by now, a language he'll get to speak again in maybe another year. The merchants at the front are doing sums in their heads. How much the silk will fetch in Kashgar versus carrying it all the way to Samarkand. Whether the extra weeks are worth the better price. Whether the jade they're planning to buy on the way back will have gone up or down since the last time they made this trip. Nobody is talking much. Sound carries strangely at night in open desert, and there's an unspoken agreement to keep it low, partly practicality, partly something closer to reverence. You don't chatter your way through a place this large and this empty. You let it be big around you. Every so often, the caravan passes the remains of something. An old wall, mostly buried. A shape in the sand that used to be a building, back when this stretch of desert had more water than it does now. Back when whole towns thrived here that the shifting sand eventually swallowed. Explorers centuries later, Orel Stein, Sven Hedin, names that mean nothing to our caravan tonight because those explorers haven't been born yet, will dig some of these towns back up out of the sand and find manuscripts, paintings, coins, entire libraries preserved by dryness the way cold preserves a mammoth. But for now, for this caravan, these are just shapes to walk past in the dark, unremarkable, just more evidence that people have always been here, always been passing through, always been leaving things behind. Let yourself go a little further into sleep here, if you're ready. There's no plot to follow. Nothing is about to happen. That's what makes a desert crossing, told slowly like this, such a strange kind of comfort. Nothing needs to happen for it to be interesting. The interesting part is simply how much space there is, how long the night is, how far away the next patch of green actually sits. By the time the sky starts to pale again, not sunrise yet, just the first hint that night is thinning out, the caravan has covered maybe 15, 20 miles. Slow, deliberately slow. Camels aren't built for speed. They're built for distance, for patience, for carrying more weight over more days than any horse could manage, provided nobody rushes them. They make camp before full daylight. Tents go up. The animals are unloaded, watered from carefully rationed skins, allowed finally to rest in whatever thin shade the tents can throw. And the whole caravan, more or less, goes to sleep for the day. The mirror image of what you're doing right now, listening to this in the dark. Chapter 4. Oasis Towns. After several of these night crossings, green starts to reappear on the horizon, and there is nothing quite like the relief of that. Not the relief of danger passing. Nothing dangerous has necessarily happened in this particular telling of things. Just the relief of the eye, after days of the same tan and gray, suddenly finding a poplar tree, a line of willows following an irrigation channel, a rooftop. Turpan is one of these towns. It sits in a depression so low that it's actually one of the hottest, driest places in the whole region during the day. But underground, those old Carez channels bring meltwater down from distant mountains, and above ground, that water turns the depression into a startling patch of vineyards and orchards, green against the surrounding sand like a held breath finally released. Caravans didn't just pass through towns like this. They stayed, sometimes for weeks, and the town's whole economy bent gently around their comings and goings. There would be a caravanserai, an inn built specifically for traveling traders, usually built around a large open courtyard where the animals could be unloaded, fed, and rested, with rooms along the inner walls for the merchants themselves, and often a small mosque or shrine tucked into one corner, and always, always a well. Picture the courtyard at evening, fires being lit in a dozen small braziers, the smell of bread baking in clay ovens built into the walls, merchants who've never met before, speaking a dozen different languages between them, finding ways to trade anyway, through gesture, through a handful of shared words, through the universal language of holding up fingers to name a price and shaking your head if it's wrong. This is one of the quiet truths about the Silk Road that's easy to miss if you only think about the goods. The goods moved, yes, silk going west, glass and wool going east, spices and horses moving in every direction. But so did everything else. Ideas about how to build a dome, recipes, religious teachings, Buddhism traveling east into China partly along this very road centuries earlier, carried not by armies, but by monks walking the same routes as these merchants. Musical instruments, board games, a whole grammar of trust and negotiation that had to be invented and reinvented at every single caravanserai between people who often didn't share a language, a religion, or a home. Much of that work of translation and negotiation historically fell to one particular group of people, the Sogdians, from the region around Samarkand and Bukhara, who for centuries were essentially the professional middlemen of the entire route. Sogdian merchants set up trading communities all along the road, from their homeland all the way to the gates of Chang'an itself, and Sogdian became something close to a lingua franca for trade, the language you'd default to if you and the person across the table from you had no other tongue in common. Our caravan tonight has at least one Sogdian trader traveling with it for exactly this reason. Not because he owns the most goods, but because he can talk to almost anyone they're likely to meet between here and the mountains. And that skill, quietly, might be worth more than any single bale of silk they're carrying. Rest here a while, in this imagined courtyard, in this imagined firelight. Nothing else needs to happen this chapter. Just the sound of a caravanserai at night. Low talk in several languages. A donkey somewhere shifting its feet. The particular creak of a well rope being pulled up slowly, hand over hand, dripping. Somewhere nearby, a woman is grinding something in a stone mortar, slow and rhythmic, the sound almost like a heartbeat if you let it be. A child who should probably be asleep is watching the strangers from a doorway, half curious, half shy, the way children in every century and every country tend to watch travelers arrive. One of the caravan's guards is mending a strap by firelight, needle and waxed thread, unhurried, because there's nowhere else for him to be tonight either. The animals, finally unburdened, make the low, contented sounds animals make when a hard day's work is genuinely over. A kind of settling, a kind of sigh that you might recognize from your own body right about now. Tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever the caravan master decides the animals are ready, they'll load everything back up and continue. But tonight, nobody is thinking about tomorrow. That's a kind of discipline this journey teaches, if it teaches anything. The day you're in is the only day that needs attention, and the road ahead will still be there exactly as it is. Chapter 5. Kashgar and the Foot of the Mountains. Weeks pass, told quickly here because they passed slowly for them. More oases, more nights of walking, more caravanserais, until the land itself starts to change under their feet, flatter ground giving way, almost reluctantly, to the first low foothills of some of the tallest mountains on earth. Kashgar sits right where several roads converge, coming from China, from India, from Persia, from the Central Asian steppe. And because of that, it became one of the great trading crossroads of the whole route. If Dunhuang was the doorway into the desert, Kashgar was something like the doorway out of it, and into the mountains beyond. The markets here were, by every account that survives, extraordinary. Not in size necessarily, but in variety. You might find, within the space of one afternoon's walk through the bazaar, silk from 1,000 miles east, felt and leather from the steppe just to the north, jade carried down from mines in the mountains nearby, dried fruit, dyed wool, and somewhere, quietly, among the more ordinary goods, small caches of turquoise or lapis lazuli carried all the way from mines in what's now Afghanistan. A blue so deep that entire empires' worth of religious paintings, centuries later, would be made using pigment ground from that same stone. Our caravan sells here. Not everything. The silk mostly continues west, where it will fetch a far better price, but enough to lighten the load and fill the purses a little before the hardest physical stretch of the whole journey, the mountains. Because ahead of them now are the Pamirs. Some travelers, centuries later, will call this range the roof of the world, and it's not much of an exaggeration. The passes through here sit higher than almost anywhere else people regularly crossed on foot or by animal before the modern age. The air thins, breathing gets harder even standing still, let alone walking uphill with a loaded camel. The nights turn genuinely cold, a cold that has nothing in common with the desert nights behind them. Marco Polo, centuries after our imagined caravan, will cross very close to this same route and will later describe, in the book that made his travels famous back in Europe, whether or not every detail in it is perfectly accurate, a high, cold plain where, he claimed, fires burned with a strange, pale color, and travelers sometimes heard voices calling to them that weren't really there, voices that seemed to lead the unwary off the path and away from their companions. Modern readers usually take this as an early, garbled description of the effects of high altitude and thin air on the mind, a kind of oxygen-starved hallucination, dressed up as folklore because folklore was the only language available at the time for describing something so strange. Our caravan doesn't linger to test that story. They move through the high passes efficiently, cautiously, roped together in places where the path narrows, wrapped in as many layers of felt and wool as they own, breathing a little harder than usual, saying very little, watching their footing. If you're still awake for this part, let your own breathing slow down further here, deliberately. In through the nose, slow, out through the mouth, slower still. Not because you're in any thin air danger of your own, just because it's a good moment to practice that kind of breathing here, safely, in your own bed, while an imagined caravan does the same thing for very different reasons, somewhere high and cold and long ago. Chapter 6. Descending into Samarkand. The far side of the mountains is a kind of relief that's hard to overstate. The air thickens again, breathing gets easier, and ahead, eventually, after more days of walking than it feels reasonable to count, the land opens out into the wide, fertile valleys of what's now Uzbekistan, and somewhere in that green, Samarkand. Samarkand is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. People were already living on this spot well before Alexander the Great's armies passed through it more than 2,000 years ago, and they've kept living here, generation after generation, ever since. By the time our caravan reaches it, the city has already been a trading hub for a very long time, and it will go on being one for a very long time after they leave, eventually flowering, centuries later, under a ruler named Timur and his descendants, into one of the most extravagantly beautiful cities of its age, its domes covered in tile the color of a cloudless sky. For our caravan, though, Samarkand means something simpler, the end of the hardest part. Water, fresh food after weeks of dried rations, real beds instead of bedrolls on packed earth, a market where, finally, the silk they've carried all this way from Chang'an will fetch its best price yet, sold on to merchants who'll carry it further still, into Persia, into the lands around the Mediterranean, eventually, after passing through more hands than anyone could ever trace, into Rome itself, where wealthy citizens will wear it without any real idea of how far it traveled or how many people touched it on the way. There's a particular historical moment worth pausing on here, gently, because it involves paper. Those few careful sheets our caravan carried out of Chang'an all those weeks ago. In the year 751, not far from Samarkand, an army of the Tang Chinese and an army of the Abbasid Caliphate fought each other at a place called Talis. The battle itself, in the scheme of things, settled very little permanently. Borders shifted only modestly, empires carried on much as before. But among the prisoners taken by the Abbasid side, historical tradition holds, were Chinese papermakers, and with them, finally, after centuries of the craft being closely guarded, the knowledge of how to make paper properly spread west. First into Samarkand itself, which became one of the earliest paper-producing centers outside China, and from there, over the following centuries, into Baghdad, into Damascus, into Cairo, and eventually, hundreds of years later, into Europe, where it would go on to help make possible almost everything Europe is famous for producing afterward. The flood of books, the spread of universities, eventually, centuries later still, the printing press itself, feeding on paper that could finally be made cheaply and in quantity, instead of laboriously imported one bundle at a time along a road exactly like this one. Our caravan doesn't know any of that future, of course. To them, paper is simply cargo, valuable, delicate, worth protecting from damp. But it's worth letting your mind rest for a moment on how strange and long the journey of a single idea can be. A technique invented in China centuries earlier, carried physically on the backs of actual camels along actual mountain paths before it could finally take root somewhere else and grow into something enormous. Rest in Samarkand a while in this story. The caravan will stay for several weeks, trading, resting the animals properly, some of the merchants deciding to turn back east here with new goods for the return journey, others pressing on further west toward Bukhara, toward Merv, toward Baghdad, toward horizons even our composite little caravan won't fully reach tonight. There is a particular kind of rest that only comes after a journey like this one. Not the rest of an easy day, but the rest of muscles and minds that have finally been given permission to stop. Merchants who haven't slept in a real bed for months find themselves, oddly, lying awake at first, unused to stillness, unused to walls instead of open sky. It passes after a night or two. By the third or fourth night in the city, they're sleeping the way you might be sleeping soon, deeply, gratefully, without dreams that need remembering. During the day, while the caravan rests, there's little urgency to anything. Bread is bought fresh each morning from ovens that never seem to go cold. Animals are reshod, their loads mended, their harnesses checked and rechecked by hands that know exactly what a small tear can cost, weeks later in the middle of nowhere. Merchants argue prices in the shade of covered market lanes, more out of habit and enjoyment than real disagreement, because everyone already knows roughly what a good price looks like. Chapter 7. Bukhara and the Quiet After. Let's follow the ones who press on just a little further before we let this story go quiet. Bukhara, a few days' travel from Samarkand, has its own long, deep history as a center of learning as much as trade. Libraries, observatories, scholars who will, centuries later, make discoveries in mathematics and medicine and astronomy that will eventually filter, slowly, the same way the paper did, into Europe's own universities, often without much credit given to where the ideas actually began. But for tonight, we're not following ideas. We're following tired travelers at the very end of a very long stretch of road, arriving at a caravanserai in the evening the way they have dozens of times now on this journey. Except this time, for some of them, this is close to the end. Some will sell everything here and start the long walk home. Others will rest a season and continue on toward Persia, toward the Mediterranean, toward destinations this particular telling doesn't need to reach. Picture the last fire of this story. Low light, the smell of bread again, and this time also of melon. Central Asian melons were, by every surviving account, extraordinary, sweet enough that travelers wrote home specifically to mention them, as if nothing else about the whole astonishing journey seemed quite as worth reporting as the taste of a piece of fruit eaten tired at the end of a hard day in good company. The Sogdian trader who's traveled with them the whole way finally has less work to do here. Sogdian is spoken as easily in Bukhara as anywhere. This is close to home for him. And for the first time in weeks, he's not translating anyone's words but his own, talking easily, laughing at something one of the other merchants says, in a language every single person around this fire happens to share. Somewhere in the retelling of this journey, centuries from now, travelers like Ibn Battuta will pass through cities exactly like this one, keeping the kind of detailed travel journals that let people like us imagine, all this time later, what it might have felt like. The food, the fatigue, the strange hospitality of strangers who had no particular reason to be kind to you except that the road demanded it of everyone, because today's host might be tomorrow's guest 300 miles further on. Marco Polo's book, and Ibn Battuta's journals, and the records the Sogdians themselves left in the languages they wrote and traded in, and the manuscripts buried and preserved by the dry desert air near Dunhuang. All of it, pieced together slowly by historians over the last century or two, is how we know any of tonight's story at all. Nobody wrote it down as a single, tidy narrative. It survives in fragments, a merchant's account book here, a monk's diary there, a pile of coins found under sand, a cave full of paintings funded by traders asking, quietly, for safe passage. Chapter 8. West of Bukhara. A smaller group presses on from Bukhara once the animals are rested and the season is still kind enough for traveling. You don't need to follow them closely. Just let the journey keep unspooling a little longer, slow and formless, the way a long night does when you're most of the way to sleep already and no longer tracking the hours. The road west leads toward Merv, another old oasis city, one that at various points in its long history was, by some accounts, among the largest cities anywhere in the world, a claim that's almost impossible to picture now, looking at what time and war eventually left of it, but true enough for centuries at a stretch. Beyond Merv, the road forks again and again toward Persia's own great cities, toward Baghdad, toward the shores of the Mediterranean, where, eventually, after so many hands and so many months, a length of silk spun by someone in China might finally be cut and sewn into a garment for someone who will never know and never think to ask how far the thread inside it actually traveled to reach them. Along this stretch, the land changes again, the way it kept changing the whole journey. Desert giving way to greener hills, hills giving way to river valleys thick with orchards, apricot and pomegranate and walnut. Trees whose ancestors, some botanists now believe, first spread this widely precisely because caravans like ours kept carrying their seeds and pits along, sometimes on purpose, sometimes only because a traveler ate the fruit and later, 100 miles on, the pit took root where it happened to fall. The nights here are gentler than the mountain nights, gentler even than the deep desert nights. A river nearby means frogs sometimes, calling from the reeds. Owls, occasionally. The camels seem to walk a little easier too, or maybe that's only the travelers projecting their own relief onto the animals, the way tired people do. There's no dramatic ending waiting at the far side of this stretch. That's rather the point. The Silk Road didn't resolve into some final, triumphant destination. It just kept going, city after city, caravanserai after caravanserai, in every direction for as long as anyone kept walking it. Somewhere ahead of our travelers tonight, other caravans are doing the same slow work in the opposite direction, carrying glassware and wool and horses east toward Kashgar, toward Dunhuang, toward Chang'an, retracing in reverse every mile we've just quietly walked together. Chapter 9. What the Road Left Behind. The Silk Road, as a single, continuous, thriving route, didn't last forever. Sea trade eventually offered a cheaper, if riskier, alternative for moving heavy goods across long distances. And slowly, over centuries, much of the traffic shifted from camel caravans to ships. Empires rose and fell along its length, and border after border made the crossing more complicated than it had been. By the time European sailors were rounding the coast of Africa to reach India and China directly by sea, much of the old overland route had already quieted considerably. But quiet doesn't mean gone. The cities are all still there: Xi'an, Dunhuang, Kashgar, Samarkand, Bukhara, still lived in, still, in their own ways, crossroads. The paper our caravan carried helped build the modern world's entire habit of reading and writing things down. The Buddhist teachings that traveled these same routes centuries earlier helped shape entire civilizations. Even something as small as certain fruits and vegetables, apricots, for instance, or the particular strains of wheat grown in far-apart parts of the world, trace some of their spread back to exactly this kind of slow, patient, camel-paced movement of goods and seeds across impossible distances, one caravanserai at a time. Nothing about this journey was fast. That's really the whole point of telling it tonight, of all nights, of all stories. There was no way to rush a camel across a desert, no way to hurry a mountain pass thin on air, no way to shorten a night's walk by starlight except by walking through it, patiently, one slow step after another, trusting that morning and the next oasis would eventually arrive the way they always had for everyone who'd made this same walk before. Chapter 10. Letting the Road Go Quiet. You don't need to remember any of this in the morning. None of it is a test. Let the names slip away if they want to. Chang'an, Dunhuang, Kashgar, Samarkand, Bukhara. They've survived 2,000 years without your help remembering them tonight, and they'll be just as real tomorrow, whether you recall a single one or not. What I'd like you to keep, if anything, is just the feeling of it. A slow walk, a wide, dark, star-heavy sky, small bells unevenly spaced, marking that everyone in the group is still together, still safe, still moving forward at exactly the pace the world allows. Let your own breathing be one of those bells now. Slow, uneven in the good way, the way of a body that's finally letting go of the day. In, out. No hurry in it at all. Think, if you'd like, of every traveler who ever made a journey like this one, all of them long since arrived, long since home, long since gone quiet in the way that whole centuries eventually go quiet. Think of how many of them, on nights very much like this, must have lain down under whatever roof they'd found that day. A tent, a caravanserai room, the open sky itself, and felt exactly this same heaviness settling into their arms and legs, this same permission to finally stop carrying anything at all until morning. Somewhere behind you now, imagine the fire at that last caravanserai burning down slowly to embers, the way fires do when nobody's tending them anymore, because everyone around them has finally, gratefully, fallen asleep. The road will still be there tomorrow. It always was. It isn't going anywhere. You can let go now. Sleep well. Let yourself settle again. If you drifted off during the last story, that's more than fine. You don't need to have caught a single word of it. This next one doesn't pick up from anywhere. It's its own quiet, slow thing, and you can arrive at it however tired you already are. Tonight we're leaving the desert behind, and the camels, and the caravanserais, and we're going somewhere much wetter, much darker, much more open. We're going out onto the Pacific Ocean at night in a canoe with no engine, no compass, no chart. Because for a very, very long time, none of those things existed yet, and people crossed thousands of miles of open water anyway. Let your breathing settle into something slow and even, the way it might if you were lying in the hull of a canoe, rocked gently by water instead of a bed. We begin at dusk on a beach, somewhere in what's now called the Society Islands, a very long time ago. Chapter 1. Leaving the Reef. The canoe waiting at the water's edge isn't one hull, but two. A pair of long, narrow hulls lashed together with a wide deck spanning between them, called a wa'akaulua in the language of the islands further north, where this same design would eventually carry people even further. Two hulls make the canoe stable enough to hold provisions, passengers, and crew across weeks of open ocean. Steady enough that a fire can even be kept burning on a bed of sand laid over the deck for cooking, for warmth, for light on the darkest nights. The sails are already up, shaped like two great claws catching what's left of the evening wind. Woven mats of pandanus leaf, if you touched one, would feel rough and dry compared to any cloth sail you might otherwise imagine. But they hold wind beautifully, and they can be lowered fast if the weather turns unkind. Loading a voyaging canoe took most of a day, not because there was so much to carry, but because nothing could be forgotten. Taro and breadfruit, some fresh, some pounded and fermented so it would keep. Coconuts, useful for the meat, the water inside, the fiber of the husk for cordage. Dried fish wrapped in leaves. Gourds for fresh water, sealed carefully, because fresh water was the one thing the ocean around them could never provide. Cuttings of plants worth starting again somewhere new, if somewhere new turned out to have room for them. Small dogs and pigs, sometimes, if the canoe was headed somewhere already known to be worth settling rather than merely exploring. Families gathered at the shoreline to see the crew off, the way families gather at every shoreline in every century, but there's no need to imagine this as a sorrowful scene. Voyaging wasn't rare here. It was simply how this part of the world worked, how one island stayed connected to a cousin island, how a whole ocean's worth of scattered land ended up settled over centuries by people who kept doing exactly this, again and again, trusting a set of skills that lived entirely inside the mind of one person standing near the back of the canoe, the navigator. He, or occasionally she, in some island traditions, carried no instruments at all. Everything needed for the crossing was already memorized. Which stars to follow as they rose, how the swells would feel changing beneath the hull, which birds meant land was near, and which meant nothing at all. This was a skill passed from teacher to student over years, sometimes decades, long before any student was trusted to guide a canoe of their own out past sight of shore. As the light fades and the reef passage narrows around them, the crew paddles the last stretch out past the breaking waves. And then the sails catch properly, and the island behind them starts, slowly, to shrink. There's a particular sound to this moment worth holding on to. The change in the water beneath the hulls as the canoe passes from the calm, shallow lagoon into open ocean swell for the first time. Inside the reef, the water had been gentle, almost flat, broken only by small ripples.
beyond it, the whole rhythm changes. Longer, deeper movements, the canoe rising and falling in a slow, unhurried cadence that will become, over the coming days, as familiar and unremarkable as breathing. Someone near the stern keeps glancing back at the island a while longer than strictly necessary, watching its outline soften into the dusk, watching the last few cooking fires on shore shrink to single points of orange light before they too disappear below the horizon. This isn't sentiment exactly, or at least not only sentiment. A navigator taking his final bearing of the departure island, fixing its exact position in relation to the first stars just beginning to appear, uses this last sight of land.
Let your own eyes stay closed here. There's nothing to watch for. The island is behind them now, and ahead is only water and stars and a very long night. Chapter 2. The Star Compass. Here's the part of this story that tends to surprise people most. There was no chart being consulted because there was no chart at all. The entire map, every star, every swell direction, every known island and the bearing to reach it, existed only inside the navigator's memory, built up over a lifetime of training and passed down entirely by voice. One of the core tools of that memory was something modern researchers now call a star compass. Not a physical object, just a mental one. The navigator memorized the points on the horizon where particular stars rose and where they later set, dividing the full circle of the horizon into named houses, each one associated with specific stars that would rise or set at roughly that point on any clear night. To hold a course toward a known island, the navigator simply kept the canoe aimed so that the correct star at the correct house on the horizon stayed where it belonged, hour after hour, star after star, as one set and the next rose to take its place. It sounds almost unbearably precise, and in the hands of a trained navigator it was. But it also had to bend around a very ordinary problem: clouds. Any given night might hide half the sky behind cover, and a navigator crossing open ocean for weeks couldn't afford to lose the course every time weather rolled through. So the star compass was only ever one tool layered among several others, and a good navigator held all of them at once, the way you might hold several senses at once without thinking about it. Sight, yes, but also feel, and memory, and a kind of accumulated intuition built from thousands of hours already spent on the water. The training for this began long before anyone was allowed anywhere near an actual open ocean crossing. A young apprentice might spend years simply learning to name every star that rose over a particular stretch of home island horizon, night after night, season after season, since the same star doesn't rise from the same point year-round. Its rising point drifts slowly with the seasons, and a navigator needed to know not just where a star rose tonight, but where it would rise in a different month, on a different leg of a longer voyage undertaken at a different time of year. Layered on top of that came the swell patterns specific to known routes, the typical wind shifts expected at certain times of year, the particular look of the clouds over islands the apprentice had visited before, and eventually, only after years of this accumulated, layered knowledge, the chance to stand near the stern on an actual crossing and start contributing real observations rather than simply absorbing someone else's. Try, if you're not asleep yet, to imagine simply memorizing this, not writing any of it down. Writing didn't factor into this tradition the way you might expect, but holding an entire ocean's geography as something closer to a song, taught through chants and stories that made the information easier to carry across a lifetime and across generations, without paper, without ink, without anything at all except voice and memory and years of practice. The navigator on our canoe tonight has been training since he was a small child, watching an older relative do exactly this same work, memorizing chants about star paths the way you might have once memorized a nursery rhyme, without fully understanding at first that the rhyme was actually a map. Chapter 3. Reading the Ocean Itself. Stars only help on clear nights, and oceans are not always kind enough to provide one. So navigators also learned something even less intuitive to someone who's never spent real time on open water. They learned to feel direction through the swells themselves. Ocean swells are different from ordinary wind-driven waves. They're older, steadier, generated by distant, persistent weather systems far beyond the horizon, and they keep traveling in roughly the same direction for extraordinarily long distances, long after the storm that created them has passed. A trained navigator could lie down inside the hull of the canoe, feeling the rhythm of the vessel rocking beneath his body, and identify, purely through that motion, which direction the dominant swell was coming from, useful even on a pitch-black, overcast night when not a single star was visible anywhere. More remarkably still, swells don't travel in only one direction at a time. When a steady swell meets an island, part of it bends around the land, part of it reflects backward, and the resulting pattern, a kind of ocean texture crossing swells meeting at odd angles, could sometimes be felt from many miles away, long before the island itself came into view. A navigator sensitive enough to this pattern might feel land approaching through the hull of the canoe hours, sometimes even a full day, before anyone could actually see it. This isn't guesswork, and it isn't mysticism, even though it can sound like both to modern ears. It's closely observed, patiently taught physical science, learned the way any craft is learned, slowly, through repetition, under the direct supervision of someone who already knows it, correcting small errors over years until the skill becomes something closer to instinct than calculation. Different parts of the body seem to have played different roles in this reading of the water. Some navigators, according to later accounts gathered by researchers who studied this tradition before it could disappear entirely, described feeling the dominant swell most clearly through the soles of the feet, or through the lower back while lying in the hull, rather than through anything so simple as watching the wave crests with their eyes, which, at night, in complete darkness, wouldn't have been possible anyway. The body, in effect, became the instrument, tuned over years to distinguish one swell's rhythm from another, the way a musician's ear learns to separate one instrument from a whole orchestra playing at once. Multiple swell systems could be present at the same time, layered over one another, arriving from different distant storms in different directions. And part of the navigator's skill lay in sensing not just one swell, but several simultaneously, holding the primary one as the main compass reading, while noting the others as secondary confirmation or as clues about weather still days away from reaching the canoe at all. If you're getting sleepy now, let this be the image you settle into. Someone lying very still in the bottom of a canoe in complete darkness, ocean moving beneath their back, feeling, not seeing, just feeling, which way home lies. There is nothing urgent about this scene. It is, if anything, one of the most patient acts of attention a human being can perform. Chapter 4. Reading the Sky and the Birds. Clear night or not, the ocean and the sky offer other clues too, ones that layer gently on top of the star compass and the swells rather than replacing them. Certain birds range surprisingly far from land during the day and reliably return to it each evening, and a navigator who understood this could use the birds themselves like a compass needle at dusk, not by following them the whole way, which would take the canoe wildly off course, but by noting the direction they flew as evening approached, since that direction, roughly, was home. White terns, in particular, were known to travel perhaps 20 or 30 miles out from land in search of fish, but no further, which made them a fairly reliable sign that an island lay somewhere within that distance, in whichever direction they'd come from. Clouds offered their own quiet signals. Islands, especially ones with any real height to them, tend to gather a small, stationary cloud above their peaks, even on days when the surrounding sky is otherwise clear. Warm, moist air rising off the land condenses as it climbs, and that same cloud tends to sit in almost the same spot day after day, a soft, silent flag marking land long before the land itself rises over the horizon. At night, closer to shore than you might expect, there was sometimes a much stranger, more beautiful sign, a pale, greenish glow beneath the surface of the water, caused by the reef and shallows disturbing bioluminescent organisms in ways the deep open ocean rarely did. Some traditions describe this glow as reflected starlight bent by the shallows. Whatever the exact cause, experienced navigators learned to recognize it as one more quiet confirmation that land, invisible in the darkness, was closer than it looked. None of these signs worked in isolation. A single bird sighting, a single patch of cloud, a single unusual swell, any one of them alone might mean very little. But held together, cross-checked against each other night after night, day after day, they built a confidence in the navigator's mind that no single instrument could have provided, because no single instrument existed to provide it. The whole system was, in a sense, the instrument, a human being trained to notice everything at once and to trust the pattern formed by all of it together. Even the color of the water and the behavior of the fish beneath it carried meaning to a trained eye. Certain fish tended to school more densely near land than in the deep open ocean, and a navigator watching the surface closely might notice a shift in how the water moved, or in the small disturbances left by fish feeding just beneath it, long before any of the more dramatic signs, birds, clouds, the glow beneath the surface, became obvious to anyone else aboard. Floating debris told its own quiet story too. A certain kind of leaf, a coconut still fresh enough that it couldn't have drifted far, a piece of wood clearly shaped by hand rather than the ocean, All suggested land nearby in a way that required no instrument at all, just the willingness to notice small things and ask what they meant. Chapter 5. A Day Adrift. Let's slow down even further here, because the days on a crossing like this were, if anything, slower than the nights. Daylight brought its own quiet routines. The sun's position through the day offered a rougher, simpler check on direction than the stars did at night, useful mostly for holding a steady course between the more precise readings taken at dawn and dusk when the horizon was clearest. Crew not needed for steering mended cordage, checked the lashings holding the two hulls together, lashings that flexed slightly with the ocean's movement by design, since a rigid connection between the hulls would have snapped under the strain that a slightly flexible one could absorb for weeks at a time. Someone always tended the small fire if conditions allowed, cooking whatever needed cooking, keeping embers alive under careful watch so they wouldn't need to be relit from nothing, which was far harder to manage at sea than on land. Fishing filled some of the day too, both for food and simply for something for idle hands to do. Trolled lines let out behind the canoe as it moved, hauled in whenever something took the hook. Rest filled much of the rest of it. Ocean crossings like this could last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, sometimes longer, and no crew could sustain constant alertness for that long. Sleep came in shifts, the way it must have on every long sea voyage, in every tradition, everywhere, across the whole history of people crossing water in small boats. Small tasks filled the gaps between larger ones. Someone might spend an hour replating a section of cordage that had started to fray, working the fibers slowly between their fingers with the same unhurried attention you might bring to any repetitive, calming task. Someone else might simply sit near the edge of the deck, watching the water slide past, occasionally noting the color of it, a deeper, clearer blue in the open ocean than anywhere closer to land, sometimes shifting subtly in ways that, to a trained eye, hinted at the depth of water beneath the hull or the presence of a current worth accounting for. Children, on the crossings that carried whole families rather than just a working crew, were kept gently occupied, sometimes already being taught the earliest, simplest pieces of the same knowledge that would, if they showed the aptitude and the interest, occupy the rest of their lives. There is something almost meditative in imagining this kind of day. No landmarks, no scenery beyond water in every direction, no particular urgency to any task because nothing could be rushed regardless. The canoe would arrive when it arrived. Worrying about it changed nothing. The only sensible response to that kind of uncontrollable timeline was the response the whole crew seems to have settled into. Patience. Small routine tasks done well. Rest taken whenever it was offered. And trust. Trust in the training. Trust in the navigator. Trust in a tradition that had already carried countless other canoes safely across this same stretch of ocean before them. You might let that same trust settle over you now, if you're not asleep already. There's nothing left for you to do either for the rest of tonight. Whatever's waiting for you tomorrow can wait exactly the way land waited for this canoe, patiently, without needing your attention until it actually arrives. Chapter 6. The Long Night. Watches. Night, though, is when this story really lives, so let's go back out into it. Watches were kept in shifts through the night, the way watches are kept on any vessel where someone always needs to be minding the course. The navigator himself rarely slept a full night through during a crossing this important. Brief rest, snatched in pieces, trusting the crew to wake him the moment weather changed or a star house needed checking against the horizon. Chanting helped some navigators hold the star paths in memory during the actual crossing, quietly repeating the sequence of stars expected to rise through the night, the same way you might hum a tune to yourself to keep from losing your place in it. Under a clear sky, a navigator could name star after star as it broke the horizon, checking each one against a chant memorized decades earlier, confirming again and again through the night that the canoe was still exactly where it needed to be. The ocean at night, out here, far past any city's glow, offers a sky almost impossible to describe to someone who's only ever seen stars filtered through streetlight haze. Thousands of individual points of light, the pale wash of the galaxy's own arm stretched overhead, occasional streaks of meteors burning across it uncommented on because the crew has likely seen hundreds of them already this crossing and no longer finds them worth remarking on. Just sky, endlessly, in every direction, met by a horizon of equally endless water, the canoe itself the only solid, known thing in the whole vast scene. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a boat at night on a long crossing. Conversation, if it happens at all, happens in low voices, more out of a general respect for the size of the silence around them than any real need for quiet. Someone near the stern watches the wake trailing pale behind them in the dark. Someone else watches the sky. The steady creak of lashings, the soft hiss of water along the hulls, the occasional snap of a sail adjusting to a shift in wind. These become, after enough nights, less like sounds you notice and more like the simple backdrop of being alive out here at all. Temperature changes noticeably once the sun is fully down, even this close to the equator, and crew not actively on watch would wrap themselves in woven mats for warmth, finding whatever corner of the deck let them lie flat without rolling with the canoe's motion more than necessary. Someone always stayed awake near the navigator, not necessarily talking, just present, ready to relay a course correction to whoever held the steering paddle at the stern, or to wake the next watch when their turn came. There was a kind of companionship in this that had little to do with words. Long stretches of shared silence, broken occasionally by a quiet observation about a star finally rising where it was expected, or a murmur about the wind easing. Let that backdrop be yours for a moment, too. Water sounds. A soft, steady creak. Nothing urgent in any of it. Chapter 7. Landfall. Somewhere in the second or third week, the exact timing depending on wind, weather, and the particular crossing being made, the signs the crew has been quietly gathering all this time start to agree with each other more and more insistently. More birds than usual flying the same direction each evening. A cloud sitting in one spot on the horizon for 2 mornings running, refusing to move on the way ordinary weather clouds do. A cross swell, faint but unmistakable now, felt through the hull by more than one member of the crew without anyone needing to say so aloud. And then, usually near dawn, when the light is just barely enough to trust what your eyes are telling you, someone sees it. A low shape on the horizon that isn't cloud, doesn't move like cloud, and slowly, as the canoe closes the remaining distance, resolves into land. green eventually, solid, real after weeks of nothing solid at all beneath anything except the two hulls holding them up. There's no need to imagine this as a wild, dramatic celebration. Mostly, by every account this tradition has preserved through oral history and later through careful ethnographic and academic study, it was something quieter than that. Relief, certainly, and satisfaction, and the simple physical anticipation of fresh water and solid ground after so long without either. The navigator's work isn't quite finished yet either. Finding the actual safe passage through an unfamiliar reef, if this island hasn't been visited by this particular crew before, still takes care and daylight and calm water. But the ocean crossing itself, the long, dark stretch where nothing but memory and feel and trained attention kept the canoe on course, is over. Sometimes this landfall was somewhere already known, a sister island settled a generation or two earlier by an earlier voyage exactly like this one, where cousins and distant relatives were waiting, more or less expecting that a canoe might arrive from the home island eventually, the way you'd expect a letter eventually, if letters had existed here at all. Sometimes it was somewhere genuinely new, an island no one from home had ever reached before, which is, over the very long span of centuries, precisely how the whole vast triangle of the Pacific, from one edge to another, thousands of miles across, came to be settled at all. Not by accident, not by a single lucky drift, but by generation after generation of exactly this kind of deliberate, memorized, patiently trained crossing. The final approach itself required its own kind of patience. Reefs surrounding an island could be treacherous even for a crew that had crossed thousands of miles of open ocean without difficulty, and finding the safe passage through to a calm lagoon meant reading the water just as carefully as the navigator had read the swells the whole way there, watching for the color change that marked deeper channel water against shallower, coral-studded shoals, listening for the particular sound of waves breaking over reef rather than simply lapping against open water. Only once that passage was found and the canoe was safely inside the lagoon did the true, unguarded relief of the crossing finally arrive. The sense that the hardest, most attention-demanding part of the whole journey was genuinely behind them now, and that whatever came next could unfold at its own unhurried pace. Chapter 8. Almost Lost, and Then Not. Here's a piece of this story that happened much more recently, and it's worth holding on to, gently, before we let the whole thing go quiet. By the middle of the 20th century, this entire tradition of wayfinding, the star compass, the swell reading, the decades of apprenticeship it required, had nearly vanished across most of the Pacific. Modern navigation instruments had made the old methods feel unnecessary to many, and the deep, specific knowledge, never having been written down in the way this story has just described it to you, was at real risk of disappearing the moment the last few people who fully held it in memory passed away without a chance to teach it onward. In 1976, a voyaging canoe named Hokulea, built specifically to test whether the old methods could still work, sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti using no modern instruments at all, guided by a navigator named Mau Piailug from a small island called Satawal. one of the very few people left anywhere who had been fully trained in this tradition since childhood. The voyage succeeded precisely as the old methods said it should, and it did something almost as important as the crossing itself. It proved, publicly and unmistakably, that this knowledge still worked, that it hadn't been myth or approximation all along, and that it was worth teaching to a new generation before it disappeared entirely. Since then, this knowledge has been taught onward, deliberately, to new navigators across the Pacific, in schools and voyaging societies built specifically to keep it alive. It's no longer confined to the memory of just one or two elders anywhere. It's been written about now, studied, recorded, passed on in new ways alongside the old ones. A tradition that came remarkably close to vanishing, saved, in large part, by people who decided one long ocean crossing was worth attempting one more time before it was too late to attempt it at all. Since that first voyage, similar canoes have gone on to sail far beyond the route between Hawaii and Tahiti, around the wider Pacific, and eventually, in later decades, on voyages that circled the globe entirely, still using these same principles wherever the crew could manage it, still training new navigators the same slow, patient way it had always been done, apprentice to teacher, over years rather than months. It's a rare thing, a body of knowledge that came this close to being lost entirely and was instead carried back from the edge of disappearing, and it's worth sitting with, for a moment, how much of it survived only because it had already been built to live inside people rather than inside objects. No charts to burn, no instruments to break, just memory, passed carefully from one mind to the next, waiting for someone to decide it was worth learning again. Chapter 9. Letting the Ocean Go Quiet. You don't need to hold on to any of this either. Let the star names go. Let the swell patterns drift off along with everything else about tonight. What's worth keeping, if anything at all, is just the feeling underneath the whole story. That it's possible to cross something enormous, an ocean, a night, whatever tonight's version of enormous happens to be for you, slowly, patiently, trusting a process bigger than any single moment of it, without needing to see the far shore the whole way there. Think, if you'd like, of how many crossings like this one must have happened over the centuries, all across that vast stretch of ocean, canoe after canoe, navigator after navigator, each one trusting the same slow accumulation of stars and swells and small quiet signs, each one eventually finding rest on some shore or other, the way you're about to find rest now. Let your own breathing be the swell now, slow, steady, coming from somewhere further away than you can quite place, carrying you gently in one direction without any effort required on your part at all. Picture the canoe somewhere out there in this story's own private ocean, sails lowered now, resting easily in calm water near a shore it's finally allowed to stop searching for. Nothing left to navigate tonight. No more stars to check against a memorized sky. You can let go now, the same way that whole crew must have let go every single night of that long crossing, trusting that the course was already set and that morning, wherever it finds you, will arrive exactly on time. Sleep well.